Good evening, America. I'm John, and tonight we're focusing on a rapidly escalating dispute between the United States and Venezuela that sits at the intersection of oil, sanctions enforcement, maritime operations, and international law, a dispute now spilling into the Caribbean Sea, into global energy markets, and into the diplomatic arena at the United Nations. Over the past several weeks, U.S. actions aimed at intercepting and seizing Venezuelan oil shipments have become the centerpiece of Washington's pressure campaign on President Nicolas Maduro's government, targeting what the U.S. sees as Venezuela's economic lifeline, crude exports. At the same time, Venezuela has responded with sharp denunciations, legislative action, and warnings that what it calls a blockade and piracy are violations of sovereignty and international norms. Here's what we know, and what remains contested. In early to mid-December, U.S. officials began describing a significant shift in posture, a move beyond sanctions paperwork and financial restrictions toward direct maritime enforcement, physically stopping vessels and seeking to take control of cargo. A pivotal moment came on December 10th when Reuters reported the U.S. had seized a sanctioned oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, a step that signaled the start of a more muscular approach to sanctions enforcement at sea. Reuters. That seizure mattered for several reasons. First, it suggested a readiness not only to deter sanctions evasion, but to actively disrupt it using U.S. assets in the region. Second, it sent an immediate signal to markets. Reuters reported the development moved oil prices, underscoring that the dispute is not just diplomatic, it's economic, and it can have ripple effects far beyond the Caribbean. Reuters. Then came a wider policy framing. On December 16th, Reuters reported that President Trump ordered what was described as a blockade of sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela, language that carries enormous historical and legal weight. The same reporting described an effective embargo atmosphere after the seizure, with loaded vessels remaining in Venezuelan waters rather than risk interception. Reuters also reported Venezuelan crude exports fell sharply amid these events, and that the situation was further complicated by a cyber attack affecting PDVSA's administrative systems. Reuters. From Washington's perspective, the message is pressure, applied through Venezuela's oil flows. From Caracas's perspective, the language of blockade is not just rhetoric, it is presented as a hostile act. As the month progressed, Reuters and other outlets reported additional actions and attempted actions at sea. On December 21st, Reuters reported U.S. officials said the Coast Guard was pursuing another tanker in international waters near Venezuela, part of what would be a series of operations in less than 2 weeks. Notably, Reuters quoted a U.S. official describing the vessel as a sanctioned dark fleet ship allegedly engaged in illegal sanctions evasion, and alleged it was flying a false flag under a judicial seizure order. Reuters. These are striking claims because they go directly to the mechanics of enforcement: flags, ownership structures, documentation, and the legal basis used to justify stopping a ship. The phrase dark fleet is often associated with shipping networks accused of disguising origin or ownership to bypass restrictions. In this dispute, U.S. officials argue such methods are being used to continue moving Venezuelan crude despite sanctions. Venezuela's response has been categorical. Reuters reported Venezuela issued statements denouncing what it described as theft and hijacking of a private vessel transporting oil and alleging a forced disappearance of crew committed by U.S. military personnel in international waters, claims the Venezuelan government said it would take to multilateral bodies including the UN Security Council. Reuters. The result is a direct collision of narratives. Washington framing its actions as lawful sanctions enforcement and interdiction of evasion networks. Caracas framing them as unlawful seizure, piracy, and escalation. The clash quickly moved from maritime operations into domestic Venezuelan law. On December 23, Reuters reported Venezuela's National Assembly approved a law introducing prison sentences of up to 20 years for those who promote or finance what Venezuela describes as piracy or blockades of oil cargoes, legislation explicitly tied to the confrontation over oil shipments and ship seizures. Reuters plus one Al Jazeera similarly reported the law's harsh penalties and the Venezuelan government's characterization of U.S. actions as piracy and blockade, underscoring that Caracas is not treating this as a temporary diplomatic flare-up, but as a sustained campaign requiring internal legal tools and deterrence. Al Jazeera. Now, step back and consider what this means operationally. For a country like Venezuela, whose state finances have long relied heavily on oil exports, restrictions on shipping translate quickly into a revenue squeeze. Reuters reported that amid ship seizures and the risk of interception, Venezuela resorted to floating storage as onshore tanks filled up, a sign of logistical strain. Reuters. For the United States, operational capacity is also part of the story. On December 24, Reuters reported the U.S. Coast Guard lacked sufficient forces to seize all the Venezuela-linked tankers it might want to interdict, and that U.S. officials were exploring additional Coast Guard assets. That report also referenced public messaging after the first seizure, including a video posted by U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi showing helicopters approaching a vessel and armed individuals rappelling onto it, emphasizing a dramatic and highly visible enforcement posture. Reuters. So while the policy is ambitious, the execution depends on assets, coverage, intelligence, and legal orders that can stand up to scrutiny, and that scrutiny is intensifying, not only in international forums, but also in media coverage and broader debate about escalation. In late December, reporting broadened to include the concept of a quarantine of Venezuelan oil. Multiple outlets citing Reuters reported the White House ordered the U.S. military to focus almost exclusively on enforcing a quarantine of Venezuelan oil for at least the next 2 months, with a U.S. official quoted as saying, "While military options still exist, the focus is to first use economic pressure by enforcing sanctions to reach the outcome the White House is seeking." Sky News +2, China Daily +2. That framing matters because it suggests, at least according to the cited official, a prioritization of economic tools over direct military confrontation, even as enforcement actions at sea carry inherent risk. When warships, cutters, aircraft, and armed boarding teams operate in contested political environments, the margin for miscalculation can narrow quickly. Now, Venezuela is not merely responding with laws and statements, it has also taken the issue into international diplomacy. Al Jazeera reported Venezuela's UN ambassador denounced U.S. strikes and a naval blockade at a UN Security Council meeting, illustrating how Caracas is elevating the dispute beyond a bilateral quarrel into a global forum. Al Jazeera. At the same time, American officials and the administration have continued to use forceful language. Al Jazeera reported President Trump issued warnings to Maduro not to play tough, while also reporting the Coast Guard was pursuing a third tanker and that the U.S. president said the U.S. would keep the ships and the oil seized so far. Language that reinforces the perception of an expanding maritime campaign. Al Jazeera. And in the background, though tonight we're focused on oil and maritime disputes, late December also saw President Trump publicly discuss a U.S. strike on what he described as a Venezuelan drug-loading facility, an event that further inflamed tensions and raised questions about scope, attribution, and escalation pathways. Reuters, +2, AP News, +2. But let's stay on oil and maritime enforcement, because that is where the strategic pressure appears most concentrated. To understand why oil shipping has become the battleground, consider Venezuela's constraints. Sanctions already complicate sales, financing, and shipping insurance. When enforcement is primarily financial, networks sometimes adapt. But when enforcement becomes physical, intercepting tankers, boarding vessels, and asserting seizure orders, adaptation becomes far more difficult, and the risks rise sharply for shipping companies, crews, and customers. At the same time, physical enforcement increases the chance of incidents at sea, misunderstandings, resistance, accidents, or retaliatory moves. Even absent violence, the mere possibility of interdiction can slow trade. Cargoes may sit offshore, buyers may hesitate, ship owners may reroute, insurers may raise rates or refuse coverage, and each of those effects increases economic pressure on Venezuela and potentially affects regional stability. Venezuela argues this is exactly the point, and that it amounts to collective punishment or unlawful coercion. The Venezuelan government has characterized U.S. actions as piracy and blockade, a framing designed to invoke international maritime principles and to rally diplomatic support. Reuters +1. The United States, meanwhile, frames actions as sanctions enforcement against evasion networks and sanctioned actors. Reuters' reporting of U.S. officials referencing judicial seizure orders suggests Washington is emphasizing a legal basis, at least domestically, for interdiction operations. Reuters +1. But there is a key issue here. Enforcement at sea touches multiple legal regimes at once: sanctions law, maritime law, flag state authority, port state control, and the rights of crews. And while officials can cite seizure orders, broader legitimacy can depend on transparency. Who owns the ship, what flag it truly flies, where the cargo originates, who is buying it, and what jurisdiction supports interdiction in international waters. This is where the uncertainty and the information war intensify. Venezuela claims crews have been forcibly disappeared. The U.S. emphasizes sanctioned dark fleet behavior and false flags. These are serious allegations on both sides, and each side is clearly working to define the narrative before independent verification settles the facts. Reuters +1. Another layer is the corporate and international business dimension. Reuters noted Chevron said its operations in Venezuela continued without disruption and in full compliance with applicable laws and regulations, a reminder that U.S. policy interacts with multinational energy operations in complex ways. Reuters. So what does this mean going forward? If U.S. interdictions continue, Venezuela may increasingly rely on floating storage, alternate routing, and more opaque networks, but those options can be constrained when enforcement becomes persistent and visible. Reuters. If the U.S. seeks to expand enforcement, it must contend with resources, including Coast Guard capacity, and the political and legal implications of sustained maritime operations near another country's coast. Reuters. Diplomatically, if Venezuela continues to take the dispute to the UN and other bodies, the conflict could widen into a regional argument over sovereignty and enforcement norms, particularly if other states fear precedent. Al Jazeera, +1. And economically, if Venezuelan exports remain sharply reduced, or if the market perceives meaningful disruption risk, oil prices can react, affecting consumers and global supply expectations. Reuters +1. Tonight, what's clear is that this is no longer just a sanctions story. It is an operational story of ships, intercepts, and enforcement, and it is a political story about how far pressure can go before it triggers broader escalation. As we continue to follow this, we'll be watching for several specific developments: confirmation of additional seizures, evidence released by either side, details on legal orders used to justify interdictions, the condition and whereabouts of crews, reactions from neighboring countries, and any move toward negotiation or de-escalation. I'm John. Stay with us.